This week, we have Pat Kirch and Jillian Swift here to talk with us about their work on Native Hawaiian land use and agricultural practices in relation to questions of long-term sustainability and with implications for modern land planning. So very excited to hear about this. I'll give a quick introduction to who these wonderful folks are. Patrick V. Kirch is the class of 1954 professor of anthropology emeritus at UC Berkeley, currently professor of anthropology at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. The author of more than 20 books and several hundred articles and chapters, Kirch has carried out archaeological research throughout the Pacific Islands for more than 50 years. His current research focuses on the sustainability of traditional agricultural practices in Polynesia. Jillian A. Swift received her PhD from the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley in 2016 and is currently the curator of archaeology at Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Hawaii. She is especially interested in reanalyzing previously excavated collections using cutting-edge archaeological science methods. Thank heavens. Her research focuses on deep-time human land use and environmental management strategies in Hawaii and the Pacific with an eye towards applications to present-day sustainability challenges. So if you have questions for our presenters, by the way, as we're going along here, please put them in the chat on the YouTube page, and I will relay those questions to them after the talk. With that, we're looking forward to our talk today on archaeological investigations of long-term sustainability, a case study from the loʻi kalo of Hālawa Valley, Molokaʻi. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. I'm going to share my screen here and hope this works okay. And Jillian will begin. We're going to go back and forth here. Kind of a, let's see, there we go. So Jillian, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And thank you everyone for being here today. I know there are a lot of exciting talks going on today. So thank you for making time for this one. What we're gonna talk about today is a 2-year NSF-funded collaborative research project that is just getting underway between UH Manoa and Bishop Museum. And what we're doing here is trying to test assumptions that are held about the long-term sustainability of traditional Hawaiian agricultural practices. So there are a lot of different traditional agricultural practices that were done in pre-contact Hawaii and also still today. The one we're especially interested in for this project is irrigated agriculture, particularly pond field cultivation of kalo. And we're especially interested in this for a couple different reasons. First, because dryland rain-fed agricultural systems have recently been the subject of pretty intensive study. These irrigated systems have not received the same amount of attention. And that's interesting because this, we know, is a really significant and foundational type of agriculture in the Hawaiian Islands. In the archaeological record, we see that early settlements are often focused in these areas where irrigated agriculture can be practiced. And we see that basically anywhere that people could be doing kalo agriculture, they are doing that. There's a lot we can talk about with wet versus dry agriculture and all of the kind of building up social distinctions and daily life distinctions between those kinds of agricultural forms. But for the sake of time, I'll just highlight a couple key aspects of irrigated kalo agriculture. One of them, which you can see in this lower photo, is that it really requires a tremendous amount of labor and engineering right at the outset before agriculture can even occur. Directing stream flow in a way that makes this agricultural system work is really critical, and it makes tremendous landscape modifications that we still see today. And then once that's done, this modification and this maintenance is an ongoing process. So really there's a focus on maintaining these irrigated systems and stream flow. And it's a community practice. It really requires joint effort because everyone's relying on the same stream. And if somebody's having issues up higher in the stream, everyone below that is also going to be facing the same kinds of issues. So it's a group maintenance, everybody coming together for this agricultural practice. Yeah, next, I think. So what we want to look at here is, these systems have long been held as this idea that they're very sustainable systems, especially irrigated agriculture, but this hasn't really been tested very intensively. So the goal of our project is to really look at, were these intensive forms of traditional Hawaiian agriculture sustainable on long time scales? And the issue with this is that sustainability is actually a pretty slippery term once you start thinking about it. So our first kind of challenge was actually to think about, what does sustainability really mean? How can we define it? And how can we look for it in the archaeological record? So the thing that we're really choosing to focus on here is thinking about nutrients and nutrient drawdown, because that's something that we can actually track through time in archaeological sites. As I mentioned, the dryland rain-fed systems have been investigated pretty intensively already, and there is evidence that there is nutrient drawdown. So these nutrients are disappearing over time. That's not to say that these systems were not very productive and very intensive, but that on longer timescales, if this continued, they may not be able to continue sustainably, at least in the aspect of nutrient cycling, without some kind of intervention. Yeah, next. So this is a really critical problem here in Hawaii, especially because we are just overwhelmingly reliant on imported food resources. There's been a really big initiative in the state to create more food self-sufficiency, but really to kind of limited success. So there is a pretty big push within communities here on individual and on organizational scales to increase food sovereignty, food self-sufficiency, and especially with reviving traditional Hawaiian agricultural practices. Next. And so this is a map done by Natalie Kurashima et al. And she started this work as an undergrad in Berkeley. So what she's looking at here is a GIS model based assessment of how much of Hawaii's landscapes are still available and could be used for productive traditional agriculture. The map on the left is all of the lands that are still available today. A pretty high number of this, something like 70%, is still zoned for agriculture and could be revived. The map on the left is a map of how much of these available lands are still viable under some really extreme climate change scenarios. So there is a lot of hope for a certain amount of resilience if we make this move towards reviving traditional agriculture. But if you're a field archaeologist, you might look at this and go, oh, we really need to ground test this. And so that's part of what we're doing, is building on these ideas that there's all of this land available for reviving traditional agriculture. But we want to go in with the archaeology into one region and really get a nice assessment of how much of this landscape was put into agricultural use, and then get an idea of the long time scale. Can we see evidence for sustainability? Are we seeing nutrient drawdowns? Are we seeing other changes that might suggest that on a really long time frame, we need to kind of rethink how sustainable this is and in what dimensions? And then that brings us to our study area, which is Hālawa Valley on Molokaʻi Island. Really beautiful valley, and I'm going to hand things over to Pat to talk about the previous research that he's done in this region.
All right, thanks, Jillian. So this is a map of Molokaʻi Island where we're working, and Hālawa is the easternmost valley. As you see there are 4 great amphitheater valleys in the eastern Molokaʻi Mountains. All of them were major centers of wet taro cultivation. Here's the Hālawa Valley itself, our study site. Not a bad place to work. And it's, I'll give you a little background here in the next few slides about previous work and why we chose Hālawa. I have a long history with this valley, and I did a project here when I was still a student back in 1969 and 51 years ago. It was one of my earliest projects. Conjunction with the Bishop Museum and the University of Hawaii. And so we're in part leveraging that work from 50 years ago with this renewed study. When I moved back to the islands a couple of years ago, I went down and visited the valley and some old friends there, and it occurred to me that the time was right to reinitiate work here in Hālawa. Hālawa, as Jillian's mentioned, was real center for this wet kalo or taro cultivation. This photograph was taken around the 1890s by the first director of the Bishop Museum. So old glass plate negative here in the Bishop Museum archives. And you can see in the foreground, I'll see if my cursor is visible. There's an irrigation channel, and you see all of these fields. And here's actually still a thatched hale, traditional Hawaiian house, but also a frame house. Hālawa was a very wealthy area. It was the most, the wealthiest valley on Molokaʻi, because they grew so much taro that they were exporting it first to the whaling fleet in Lahaina, Maui, during the whaling trade, and later supplied the leprosy settlement of Kalaupapa with all of their kalo and poi. So a very important center of wet valley agriculture. More than 1,000 irrigated fields have been mapped in the valley. As I said, I go back there a long time. I actually first visited the valley even before the 6970 project. In 1964, I was there camping out with my father, and I walked across the stream and encountered this gentleman, Sam Enos, who at the time was the last cultivator, traditional cultivator of kalo in the valley. A tidal wave hit Hālawa in 1946 and salted a lot of the fields. Most of the people left at that time. So by 64, only old Sam Enos here. But there you see him standing by his kalo fields, and he explained to me how that system worked and showed me how he pounded poi and so on. So a lot of memories there. In 1969-70, when we did the initial Bishop Museum University of Hawaii project, we mapped the valley settlement pattern, which you see here from our report. I think you can make out all of the fields. I'm trying to get my cursor. Here we go again. So we have two systems on each side of the valley with the stream meandering through. Each of these fed by two large irrigation ditches. And then we have smaller systems up in the inner valley. The map actually goes farther here than shown in this version. So it really is a great place to study traditional agriculture. Here's a map of a small irrigated system right up at the top of the valley near the waterfalls that, again, we made in 1969 and 70. Now, while these valleys are very important for wet irrigated kalo, there's another aspect to this that's important in our project. And that's the area that is above the irrigated fields, above the irrigation ditches, the slopes between the irrigated systems and the cliffs. That's a lot of land area. And these areas are referred to as colluvial slopes. They're made up of colluvium, not alluvium, which is stream transported, but colluvium, which is from mass wasting of rock, landslides, debris flow, so on, coming off down the cliffs. And back in 2011, Jillian mentioned Natalie Kurashima, who was an undergraduate student in natural resources at Berkeley. She worked with me on an honors thesis where she did a GIS modeling of how much area in these Molokaʻi valleys would be in the colluvial slope zone and potentially utilizable for intensive dryland farming. And her paper was so good, we got it published in the journal Archaeological Science, and it led to her further work that she's been doing here. She now has her PhD from the University of Hawaii. But when we modeled, as part of that paper, we modeled Hālawa Valley, and this is the GIS model for the valley that Natalie came up with. And the blue area you see is the potential, good land for wet taro, and it pretty much corresponds with the archaeological evidence for where there are irrigated fields or were irrigated fields. But all the green area above that is colluvial slope that could also be potentially in very intensive cultivation. So one of the things we're trying to do in this project is test out the importance of the colluvial slopes. What contributions did those make, and how were those integrated as a total system? Back 50 years ago, we mapped some of these colluvial slope areas. This is a map of the Kapana area. We'll talk more about that, Jillian, a little bit later, because we've begun working there again. But you can see the complexity of features. Some irrigated fields down here, a bit here, but all of this area, a mix of small agricultural terraces, not irrigated, but perhaps utilizing intermittent flow at times of heavy rain, and then integrated with house sites and agricultural temples, etc. This is one bit of data I want to show you very briefly. Jillian's mentioned nutrients, and nutrients are a key part of our project. And the importance of the colluvial slopes is indicated here. Some preliminary data that we have from Hālawa Valley, where we're comparing upland soils. Those are the old leach soils on the ridges above the valley. And we have the alluvial soils, which are the irrigated pond fields. And in between, we have these colluvial soils. And if you just look at one data set here, base saturation, which is a percentage of total nutrient availability in the soil. So it's 1 to 100, 100 being maximum. And you see that the old eroded uplands are very low, 12. The alluvial soils are quite good at 43, but look at the colluvial soil, 61. So they actually have higher nutrient status, potentially higher productivity, even than the irrigated fields. So as Jillian mentioned, what we've proposed in our National Science Foundation proposal is that a quantifiable test of sustainability is whether over the long term there's any decline or degradation in nutrient status and or the resource base basically there. So if we in our work see continued high nutrient values in agricultural soils that we expose through excavation and so on, then that test would say, yes, these systems were sustainable in the long term. If, on the other hand, we start to see declines in nutrients, then that could suggest that over long time periods, we might have declining productivity. Just very briefly, just a few other background aspects of the valley, just so you get a sense of what's there. So we have not only these agricultural sites, extensive terracing and so on, but we do have residential sites as well. This is all, again, from work done 50 years ago, but we're going to be continuing some of this kind of mapping and testing in our new work. You see house habitation terraces, adjacent cooking areas, and there are some 14 agricultural temples as well. These were recorded initially in 1909 by John Stokes, Fish and Museum's first archaeologist. So fortunately we have data, and he was led to these sites by informants who told him these were temples and the names of them. And we'll mention these again a little later in the talk because we've been mapping and working on some of these. Trying to date the temples will be very important in terms of when the agricultural system was being intensified in prehistory. There's one major temple site, what in Hawaii is called a luakini, or a temple of human sacrifice. These were structures where the ruling chiefs would officiate, usually at times of war or after the successful conclusion of war. This is quite massive structure. A lot of rock piled up there on the northern side of the valley. And in tradition, it was supposedly dedicated by a high chief from Hawaii Island, Alapainui, after he came to assist in a war of the Kona chiefs against the Ko'olau chiefs of Hālawa. And then one other important aspect of the valley's archaeology is there's a sand dune midden site at the base of the valley, which I discovered back in the day in 1969 and 70. We excavated fairly extensively. See here pictures of the excavation ongoing. There were remains of round-ended house structures. It's quite rich in shell and bone midden, as well as a number of artifacts. Here's the plan of the excavation, stratigraphy, reconstruction of what some of these round-ended houses may have looked like. The site needs to be redated. The artifact styles there suggest it begins quite early in the sequence of Polynesian or Hawaiian occupation, early styles of fishhooks, adzes, etc. Back 50 years ago, radiocarbon dating was a lot more primitive, a lot larger error bars than we have today. We've attempted to do some redating. This is an Oxcal plot of dates from the site. But the reason this site is important, Jillian is going to tell you that right now with this slide. I turn it back to you, Jillian.
Sorry, I gotta unmute myself. hardly the only reason this site is important, but something that really excites me as a zooarchaeologist is the tremendous quantity of faunal remains that they found in these excavations of the dune site. And you're probably getting the sense that this was a Bishop Museum project for how many different Bishop Museum archaeologists we've mentioned here. So these collections are now at Bishop Museum, and so it is an exciting opportunity for us to combine reanalysis of museum collections with new excavations. So what you're seeing in this graph is over time this decline in fish remains and a steady increase in pig and dog. And so it really is a shift in attention for what kind of proteins they're procuring here at this site. And it also, much like colluvial agriculture, is an overlooked component of these traditional agro-ecosystems. Similarly, pig and dog husbandry is often overlooked in these types of agricultural projects. And really, I think this is probably a key component that really needs to be examined if we're going to look at these systems holistically, which is the ultimate goal. So one of the things that I'm going to undertake is a kind of continuation of the work that I've started at Berkeley, which is stable isotope analysis of commensal fauna. So I'll get to talk about rats again as looking at those as proxies for nutrient flows. So we can not so much quantify, but at least characterize what types of nutrients are flowing into this system, especially with regard to carbon and nitrogen and how that's changing over time. And then with pig and dog, we can also augment that kind of research, but also look at what kind of husbandry practices are occurring, how these animals are foddered, and how they integrate into the larger agro-ecosystem. Next. And so that kind of wraps up the previous work, and it's exciting to be able to go back and reanalyze these collections with new methods. And we also we've just wrapped up our first field season in Hālawa Valley, where we concentrated on two ili or small slices of the valley, Puʻalau and Kapana. So I do just want to spend a moment to talk about this because, ultimately what we want to do, we want to be applicable to today. And one of the impetus for doing this project in Hālawa Valley specifically is that there is already a really strong desire on Molokaʻi and within Hālawa for reactivating these loʻi for increasing traditional agriculture. So we've been working with the community as closely as possible at all phases. Next slide. I'm not really gonna go into this because I feel like I'm pretty much preaching to the choir here. So I'm really just leaving this slide to kind of highlight some of the, especially Native Hawaiian archaeologists who are really driving this forward and some of the resources that have guided our own integration of community-oriented practices into this project. So, for us, what this has looked like is that, even before we wrote the grant, we started talking to folks on Molokaʻi and especially within Hālawa Valley on an individual and organizational level, trying to figure out what kind of outcomes they'd like to see from this kind of project. We kind of focused it into three different things. One is that our work is going to contribute to their long-term goals for cultural and ecological restoration. And so we've taken that to heart and integrated it into various aspects of the proposal and making sure that all of our research objectives address this. They also wanted to be, continued involvement in the project and especially get some of that lab and museum and collections-based training. So we started doing that in the field and that will continue on through the project. They also would like all newly excavated materials to remain on Molokaʻi to the extent possible. This is really a growing kind of desire across the Hawaiian Islands to return collections to their home island and develop facilities that can house these collections on island so that communities can really reconnect with them because, Bishop Museum is on Oahu, which is, it's expensive and difficult to come here and see these things. So that's something that we're kind of working on more broadly with various community partners as well outside of this project. Next slide. So part of this was having visitors and volunteers. We were working with a couple organizations on Molokaʻi and some of their fellows came and visited and worked at the site. including one volunteer who had a very sweet puppy who was very eager to get in and help us excavate. You can see Gamby on the left there.
Okay, I think it's back to me, Jillian, for a second, for a couple of slides here. So the work this summer, an important part of it was mapping. And some of you know it's my forte. I love to map. And I do that, of course, with this ancient but wonderful trusted technology called the plane table and alidade. That's my W&E Gurley 1947 alidade there. And the reason for that is other kinds of modern digital technology, total stations and so on, allow you to take points, but they don't allow you to draw the architecture in the field. And the plane table and alidade still allows me to accurately map and then draw all those rocks that are so carefully placed and piled up to form terraces and house sites and so on. Of course, we're not totally in the dark ages. And so you see my Trimble there next to the alidade case. And so, yes, we're using GPS and GIS, and these maps will all be digitized, and then everything is being integrated into a GIS database for our project, including many historical maps. There's some beautiful maps from the late 19th century and early 20th centuries that we're georeferencing and bringing into our database as well. But here's a scan of one of 5 map sheets that I made this summer in the Puʻalaʻau area, just to show you what some of this looks like. So you see various walls there that are defining probably land section boundaries, terraces of various kinds, and sort of in the left center, substantial platform, which is one of these agricultural terraces, agricultural temples, in this case, Puʻalaʻau Heiau. I think, Jillian, this is back to you now to talk about the terrace system.
Sure, I don't think so, but I can do that. This is one of our objectives is really within these 2 small regions that we selected was to get an understanding of how these ag systems developed over time. So Pat's large scale mapping is really giving us an idea of the layout. And this was an interesting spot because a lot of this area we assumed was exclusively colluvial slope agriculture. So these rain-fed systems with retaining wall terraces. When Pat started mapping this area, what he slowly realized while he was doing this was that it looked like there was a relic side stream that was actually feeding into this specific area. So we think, and this is just an early hypothesis that we want to test, we think we actually have a small irrigated system right here that we previously thought was colluvial slope. So we spent a lot of time actually focusing in on this region in Puʻalaʻau.
I'll just add to that to say that what it looks like is going on here is they're not only irrigating this little set of terraces, which you can see was built into a boulder ridge, but they actually were doing a kind of hydraulic engineering because it looks like they're actually moving sediment off this little side stream into to fill and form these terraces. So we were really quite amazed at the extent of really engineering of this landscape.
Yeah, so like I said, we spent a good amount of time in these terrace areas, especially this little side stream area. I think we ended up putting about 6 units in from top to bottom just to get a real understanding of its development and sedimentology. Yeah, these are agricultural terraces. So primarily what we're trying to do broadly in these excavations is to just recover charcoal for radiocarbon dating and start to get a sense of development across the region. But we also want to investigate these stream flow and architecture and agricultural ideas. So within the grant, we are also incorporating pollen starch and phytolith analysis to get some sense of what people were growing here. Our collaborator, Noah Lincoln at UH, is doing a lot of soil chemistry to see how this is changing over time. In the photographs, you can see Kylie Tuitavuki, who some of you might have known because she did her undergrad at UC Berkeley. She's now one of Pat's grad students. She was with us all 5 weeks and is a complete champion, just digging holes all 5 weeks with a big smile on her face. So I'm excited that she's coming into this project as well. And part of her master's thesis is going to be doing granulometry on this irrigated side stream, especially, but in various areas, so we can look at, granulometry and get a sense of stream flow and deposition. And then this is just a profile drawing of the unit that is kind of at the very bottom of this section. So some of our units towards the top were pretty shallow. Once we got to this terrace at the bottom, you can see on the left all of these stones. That's like a stone facing of I think it was 5 courses maybe. It was massive and it went very deep. This is about 1 meter deep. And what we're seeing is several layers of deposition here. And this seems to be an area where they are, as Pat mentioned, engineering this stream flow to keep rejuvenating this area for agriculture with successive deposits, right? So we get areas of cultivation, and then they're kind of sandwiched between areas of deposition. And so this is really where we're focusing a lot of our lab work, is on this deep trench to really get an understanding of that long-term development. And then, in addition to the agricultural systems, we really wanted to understand how this area was developing broadly. So we did do a few little test excavations in some pre-contact house sites. This is one with a little adjoining terrace on the left there. And, as you might expect, these soils are not super amenable to preservation. So again, here the objective was mostly to get charcoal for dating. We did find a few additional artifacts, some bone, some shell, things that speak to, it could clearly identify these as house sites distinct from the agricultural regions, but not a lot more than we're finding in the terraces.
I think this is back to me now. Yeah, so we also have evidence in Puʻalaulau of 19th century occupation overlaying the earlier pre-contact occupation. And this is, I hope you're not, I'm seeing some warning thing. I hope it's not being shared there across the screen, but there's a big terrace here, house terrace, that dates to, based on historic period artifacts, bottled glass and iron and so on, sometime in the middle of the 19th century. Interestingly, this site does not show in the land records from the 1850s, although we have reason to believe it may have been the house site of the konohiki, or land manager of the valley. I don't know what this, is anybody seeing this warning thing? Is that, you're all seeing it? I don't know what Zoom is doing its thing. Anyway, we'll just move ahead. So another innovation, at least for us in this, is the application of drone photography. So it's very hard to photograph a lot of these sites when you're just down on the ground. So this last spring, I acquired a Mavic Pro drone, and I see here, Jillian and I were testing it out in the spring, and then we applied it during our field work in the valley. So it was interesting to learn to fly this drone between trees and a tree canopy, let me tell you. Very easy when you're out in the open air, but we actually had to do a lot of clearance of small trees, but the drone worked really well once we figured this out. And so here I am flying this drone and taking pictures of that 19th century house site there. You can see the steps leading up to the house terrace. And we're hoping that this well, not only gives us, beautiful oblique views, as you can see here. This is Puʻalaulau Heiau, the agricultural temple, a couple of views of it, but also with vertical shots, as you see here. This is looking down on Puʻalaulau. So combined with the plane table mapping and GPS positioning, then we hope to do photogrammetric mapping of some of these sites, temple sites and ag terrace sites, so really very highly accurate mapping, sort of stone by stone. And among other things, just to provide a documentary record for future generations of what these temples are like at the present time. should there be any further degradation of them, so on. I've never seen that kind of window before. I have no idea how to make it go away, folks, but move this window away from the shared application. Yeah. Does it move? Nope, doesn't move. Anyway, and then just mention here, Kalani Pruet, as you see in this slide, sort of the spokesperson for the local community in the valley. He's a traditional landholder. And as Jillian mentioned, you know, we've been working closely with the community. So Kalani came up one day when we were mapping and took a look at Hālawa Heiau and was very interested. He's an artist who has a MFA in fine art. He went back to his house and then came up the next day or two with this painting that he'd made, which is this kind of vision of what the area might have looked like a few hundred years ago, with a thatched house there and the temple in the foreground. So our work's even inspiring the local artistic community. And I think this is on to you now, Jillian. Talk about Kapana excavations.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time in Puʻalalo, maybe more than we should have, but we ended up wrapping up the season moving over to Kapana, which is just a really incredible area. What you can see from Pat's map is a lot of these upper slope kind of colluvial areas. And then also, again, we have side stream terracing here that is even more apparent than you see in Puʻalalo. And then at the bottom, just tremendous, massive loʻi fields. These on your bottom right are just really spectacular to see. And hopefully we can convey a little of that with the pictures. So this again is an area where we did some drone photography, and hopefully what you can see here is, in contrast to Puʻalalo, like this area is still very, very intact and was really built up very carefully and elaborately. So a series of terraces that are descending down into the valley. They almost look like stair steps. And so this is another side stream irrigation system, but very obviously a side stream irrigation system. So it's a very nice comparative to the one that we're looking at in Puʻalalo to look at these dynamics. This is kind of just another shot to give you another view of this. There's an excavation over at the right. You can see a couple people over there. I think that's actually a historic house site that Pat's going to talk a little bit more about, because they did excavate that one previously. So this is an area that they've already done some work in, and we've been submitting some samples from the excavations in this area to try and redate from the collections that we have. But it's a little bit intermittent, and there are areas where I think we could really benefit from going back in and re-excavating and redating these sites. So that's going to be a part of our explorations in Kapana. I think we'll probably be back to this area in a subsequent field season. I think this is you actually, Pat, is it?
It was going to be used, though. That's okay. This is one of my plane table sheets of this system that you've been looking at the drone photos of. You can see, in this case, the fields are much more regular, unlike the little system in Puʻalalo that was engineered between boulders. This one is more substantial, more rectangular fields. And this is the middle section coming down. Excuse me. And then, yeah, Jillian, you want to mention this? This is you.
Yep. Yeah. So like I said, we spent a lot of time in Puʻalalo and really got fascinated by that side stream irrigation area. So we didn't have a ton of time in this Kapana section. I think we ended up opening only 4 units. But again, following a similar kind of pattern to what we did in Puʻalalo, we did 1 unit way at the top of these systems and 1 at the bottom, and had a spirited debate about whether or not we should open a unit in one of these kind of more marginal looking areas, which we kind of compromised and did a small unit there. And then I think, 1 more in a house site, just to try and get a sense for the timing and expanse of this area, and hopefully, do a similar comparative with that really deep unit that we had in Puʻalalo. This is kind of a similar unit that we can contrast the engineering and sediment deposition and these soil nutrients, which I think is going to be really critical to understanding long-term sustainability in both of these regions. An aerial view of our excavation here, I think down at the lower part of the terrace, and then below this are the massive expanses of loʻi fields. This was kind of a cool site because it also went pretty deep. At first, we didn't think it was going to. It was very rocky. There were some massive rocks just a few levels down. But with the help of our volunteers, we actually were able to lift these giant boulders out, and underneath it was a bunch of actually artifacts like lithic flakes and volcanic glass and things like that that suggest maybe there was a house site here even earlier, and then the ag system was built on top of that later on. So that's kind of an exciting aspect that we might be able to explore. And we've submitted we're in the process of submitting radiocarbon dates, and we'll see what that sequence looks like. Yep, here it is again from another angle. Same story here, very exciting site. Kylie again, you'll just see Kylie in every single photo digging these holes. Thanks, Kylie.
Okay, I think that's back to me now. It's my cue. As Jillian mentioned, there was also a habitation terrace that's just above the irrigated fields here in Kapana. It looks down over them. This was a site that had been excavated 50 years ago, and we had a radiocarbon date on, but with a very large error margin to it. So we wanted to do a small re-excavation here, which we did in front of the face, and actually got a lot of lithic material, quite a lot of actually some midden material, and a lot of good charcoal for dating. So that will allow us to refine the chronology for this. I'm going to just very briefly try to stop this share and reshare and see if that stops this outrageous thing that's keeps coming into my screen. I don't know if that will work or not. Maybe that worked. I've never seen that before. Okay, maybe that stopped it. Now, yeah, and here's a drone photo also. Lovely with this drone. Now you can just kind of zoom in and get these nice oblique shots of sites and people working and so on. So that's testing that habitation terrace. We also in Kapana cleared off another one of these agricultural temple sites, these fertility temples, Heiau, Ho'oluai as they're called in Hawaiian, Kapana Heiau here. So see our drone photo of that. And here's the side view of it. Nice stone-faced terrace there. And we did an excavation at the base of that temple, agricultural temple, in process here, again, to try to date it primarily. Jillian was excavating. We not only got good charcoal in context below the basal stones of the temple, but in this case, both dog and pig bone remains were preserved. So that was an interesting finding here. So we're just about to wrap up here. I think we're on time. And to mention, of course, this has been kind of a, what we intend to do, background talk, and then sort of what we did in our summer vacation, so to speak, over there for 5 weeks in the valley. And now comes, of course, the serious part of analyzing the remains that we uncovered. And so we've actually, Jillian and I have selected 36 samples for radiocarbon dating. Those are about to go off to Miguel Murakami, who's an expert in charcoal identification, will identify them to taxa. So we select short-lived taxa for dating, and will also give us information on plants that we're growing and being burned as fuel. We're going to submit other samples to Mark Horrocks, the University of Auckland, to do the pollen, opal phytolith, and starch analysis for us. And of course, working also with Noah Lincoln on the nutrient analysis of the sediments, and Kylie will be working on various aspects of sedimentology, granulometry. So this will all take place over the next 8 months or so. And COVID permitting, we plan to be back in the field. Some brief trip, maybe in December if we can, brief for a week, spring break, but then another 5 weeks next summer, another field season. So just a couple of shots to wrap up. It was not all work all summer. We did have one lovely Sunday that we hiked up to the beautiful waterfall there, Mo'ula Falls. Everyone got to go swimming in the icy cold water, and occasional barbecue. The deer on Molokaʻi are running all over the place, and we were gifted with several bags of venison meat. So there I am, barbecuing some venison for us. And the final shot here.
Again, sorry.
What's that? More venison than you'd ever want to eat. So this final shot here is just of our team with some of our friends in the valley. The gentleman in the middle there in the red is Filippo Solitario, now in his early 80s. He is the respected kupuna or elder of the valley, born there in Hālawa, and has returned to live out his days there. I knew him 50 years ago, and he's been such a wonderful friend. And that's his son, Greg Solitario, who's carrying on the traditions of the valley and who actually worked with us. We were able to employ him as a research associate, which he thought was fantastic. And then on the right is Catherine Aki, who's another landholder of the valley. And she volunteered with us for 4 of the 5 weeks. Then, of course, you see Kylie there. To Kylie's right is Noah Lincoln, our collaborator at the University of Hawaii, and his student, Dolly Atupunga from Western Samoa, who was with us also for a couple of weeks sampling soil. So I think that wraps it up. Yep, I'll stop share, and we have time for questions if people want to send them in by chat, I believe is how you're doing this.
Wonderful. Thank you for such a delightful talk. Yeah, folks who are watching on YouTube, please put your questions in the chat there, and I will relay them. To give folks some time for that, I have a question of my own related to the colluvial soils in particular. I don't know what the geological substrate is out there. I assume something volcanic. But I know that nutrient recharge is a real issue for those soils often. But it seems pretty neat that the colluvial soils have such high base saturation and other sort of nutrient content. I'm wondering if that has to do with sort of recharge from overlying, in a sense, bedrock. And curious if you guys have a sense of what sort of the time scale of those landslides or mass movements are, if that's something you're looking at.
Yeah, they are being recharged, as you call it, basically by mass wasting. So, this is, you have a volcano that's been incised by a stream valley, and then the cliffs are continually, producing fresh material. So that, in particular, we're talking about phosphorus here, which is the main rock-derived nutrient that's so important, but others as well. The time scale is geological in terms of these landslide events and so on. You can see big landslide tongues, debris flows of these boulders, but it's obviously taking place over a time scale of thousands of years.
Neat. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff to look at. So I've got a couple of questions from our very own Christine Hasdorf here in the chat. One very practical question is, did you eat taro while working in the taro fields?
Not so much while we were in the taro fields, but yeah, at the community meetings especially. There are some people who are now moving back into the valley and reactivating the loʻi and doing traditional agriculture themselves. And a few of those folks would bring in some kalo to share at the community meetings and in gatherings.
So I suppose a follow-on question to that, also from Christine, is the hope to reinvigorate taro farming, particularly in these fields that you're mapping and working on?
Yeah, one thing we kind of didn't talk about is that most of this area is owned by a single landowner, which is Pu'uahoku Ranch, and then scattered about that are what we call kuleana landowners, which are people who have a long held genealogical claim to these lands. And of course, other people who have been displaced from those claims, which is complicated in itself. But the ranch is actually also really interested in pushing forward, reviving these landscapes for traditional agriculture, and themselves are involved in cultivating traditional plants. And so that they actually even just applied for a big grant to try and get this project going. There's a lot, as you can imagine, of logistical issues that they really need to work out, and archaeology can only help so much with that kind of thing. But there's definitely a huge drive in the area to continue to revive, and those folks who have land there already are really getting involved in reactivating these loʻi.
Yeah, as Jillian mentioned, that the valley was largely abandoned after the tidal wave in '47, but over the last 20 years or so, people have begun to come back. So Filippo and his son Greg, for example, they have active taro fields going. Catherine's family does as well. They're maintaining one of these awai or irrigation channels, to feed their fields. It could be extended much farther, many more fields that are still overgrown, abandoned. On the north side of the valley, there's some cultivators there as well who have opened up fields in one of the ditches on that side of the valley. But there's a lot of interest in potentially reactivating and expanding these traditional fields. The infrastructure is there. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is the stone-faced terraces and all of that are there. Unfortunately, there's been a huge growth of invasive trees over the last 50 years or so, especially Java plum, and now African tulip has come in and albizia is coming in. So it's a big issue in having to clear out this growth over these, but the infrastructure is still there underneath everything.
Cool, thank you. We have a question from Tim Gill in the YouTube chat. Are there any first-person accounts of life and agriculture in the valley that you have found to be useful?
Well, there's a historic, some written records. There's a guy who visited Hālawa around 1850. His name was Marston Bates, but he published a book called Sandwich Island Notes by A. Haule, with a capital H. And for those of you who know, Haule is what Hawaiians call foreigners. So he was his pseudonym, A. Haule. But Bates has about 5 pages in his book describing Hālawa in 1850, and it's a wonderful, wonderful description. There are a lot of other ethnohistoric records, and one of the objectives, actually, we said in our NSF proposal, is to compile all of that we can find. Hawaiian language and newspaper accounts, for example, we expect there'll be quite a lot. There are these maps that were made for the Bishop Estate, which once owned the valley. So that's another aspect. We didn't go into that today, but Jillian, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, just that, one of the records that I'm excited about digging into are these Mahele land claim records, which is going to be really important for understanding how the land tenure system developed. So the Mahele is when this transformation occurs, right? When it goes from this traditional Hawaiian system of land tenure to privatization. And then, what happened is people who had been living on and working these lands have to kind of go in and make a claim for themselves to become private owners of the land area. So it's really revealing a lot about genealogy and history and understanding the dynamics of people inhabiting and working on the landscape that I think will be really fun to get into.
Yeah, just for those of you who know something about Hawaii, just add to this. The valley was awarded in the Mahele 1848 to the High Chiefess Victoria Kamamalu. She was of the Kamehameha Kahumanu group. And so it went into the hands then of Bernice Pauahi Bishop, and it actually was part of the Bishop Estate. And was one of those unusual places. Mostly the estate kept its lands, but they sold this to the owners of Puhoku Ranch in the early 20th century. So that's when the land, the larger Ahupua'a, as we call it, was transferred over and became part of Puhoku Ranch. But there were close to 100, I think, smaller kuleana claims, Mahele claims that were made, and many of those were awarded. So we have all the documentation on that, and it's going to be a rich, rich archive in terms of how lands were, ordered the kinship relations between people, how the irrigation system was managed, etc.
All right. Well, we've got a couple more questions. First, I want to go to what is perhaps our youngest viewer, Ollie, age 6, who is writing from Lisa Mahar's account here, posted on YouTube. Wants to know where the stream starts and if there are any big lakes nearby.
Hi, Ollie. Good to hear from you. The stream starts way up in the mountains, Ollie, the high mountains, and it rains a lot up there. And so that's why this stream flows all the time. And when you and your mom and dad can finally get free and come back to Hawaii next time, I'm going to take you up there to the waterfall Mo'ula, and you can swim in that beautiful waterfall.
All right. So one more question, and I think we'll make this our last one, is coming from Meg Conkey. How will you evaluate what you mean by sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, so, that's something we've been thinking a lot about and had to really go back to the drawing board several times when we were writing the proposal of okay, if we're going to say we're assessing long-term sustainability, what does that mean? And so I like to say that we're really not, we're not trying to check a box of yes or no, this was sustainable. It's really more how was it sustainable and which aspects of it can we see through archaeology. And so that's why there's been such a strong focus on nutrients, because that's something we can actually trace. We can look at nutrient drawdown, especially with our collaborator, Noah Lincoln, who's got all the soil science. And then we can also characterize it. So both kind of qualitative and quantitative measurements of just looking at these nutrient flows. And that's really, we'll be very explicit about the fact that this is not a holistic sustainability, right? It's just these aspects that we think we can measure on long time scales.
Yeah, let me just add to that some of the work that the Hawaii Biocomplexity Project did on dryland systems on the Big Island of Hawaii and on Maui, which I was involved in. That's a project that when I was at Berkeley, Meg, you'll remember we had a joint NSF grant on with Stanford University. And there we were able to show that there was both in the Kohala Field system in in Hawaii and in Kahiki Nui of Maui, there's some evidence for nutrient decline in these soils. And I won't go into how we measure that all that time right now, but it's been published. And we're talking over a long period of centuries here, right? But so if there is nutrient decline, and that's what plant production ultimately depends on, then your yields may be lowered gradually over time. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of sustainability here. If your yields are going down gradually over time, then the system over the long term of centuries is not really sustainable. At least it's not, the level of production is not sustainable. Now, it's never been tested for the wetland systems. And so that's why we wanted to propose this, turning to the wetland valleys, which are very different because especially the irrigated fields, you've got constant nutrient flow in and dissolved nutrients in water and a different kind of soil dynamic going on. And we also know these colluvial systems are very rich with nutrients. So it will be very interesting to see. And it may be that the story in Hālawa is quite different from the dryland systems, but this is what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it in a way that where we are defining what we mean by sustainability in very explicit terms that hopefully are quantifiable.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and we hope to have you all back again soon.
Great. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah.
All right.